So these are your notes on the feudal system of the Middle Ages. This was a very complex and complicated system. These are more simplistic notes, so it's not going to have every detail, but it's going to make sure that you understand the basics of the system. So after Charlemagne, this whole empire kind of started to fall apart. There was chaos, fighting. No one really knew who was in charge and what was going to happen and who could protect people. And feudalism was a way to get an army together very quickly. And the idea is everyone serves somebody above them, and the person above them gives something to the people below them. So a vassal is literally someone who serves. That's what the term means. So a pyramid of vassals is like in this picture right here. And it kind of shows the social pyramid of the time. So you can see peasants at the very bottom, and then you have the knights, then the nobles or the lords, and then the king at the very top. And this pyramid does show what all they do for each other, but I have that on another slide that might be a little easier to read than this one. So the basic government and society was completely centered around this feudal system. This is how they decided to structure their government of the time. And the lord owned the land and everything in it. He basically owned the entire town. And then he would allow people to live there in return for their service. So it was almost like paying rent to somebody else. But his job then, not just allow them to live there, but he also has to protect them. So basically, in essence, you can live here. You're going to give something to me in return, but I will keep you safe while you live here. And that was something that people were worried about because they had seen all these different Germanic invasions and they had seen wars happening, and the average person didn't have the means to protect themselves. So knowing that they had an army and somebody who was looking out for them made them feel safe. So this is the pyramid that I told you was a little bit easier to understand, and it shows how each person gets something in return for their service. So notice the king's at the very top, and he gives land to the nobles, so he owns the whole kingdom. He gives large pieces of land, basically like whole villages, to each noble. The nobles then give some land to the knights, and then the peasants get little pieces of land to build their houses. And the peasants are also going to get protection from the knights. The knights are basically the army. But they all have to give something, right? So the peasants are going to give food and services for the knights. They're also paying taxes. So basically they're giving money, they're giving the crops that they grow, any of the basic running of the village, the peasants are going to do. And they're going to provide that to the knights for protection. They also, that stuff gets passed up to the nobles as well. So the knights will pass some of that up to the nobles. The knight's job is to protect the nobles and be their military. And then the nobles have to give money and basically their army to the king. So if the king decides to go into battle, we're giving you our knights because you have let us have this tract of land. And they're paying taxes. So each group is doing something for someone else. Some are doing far more. For example, the peasants are running all the farms and all the shops and keeping up with all the work that the nobles don't want to do. And the nobles just have to pay the king money that they got from the peasants. So the typical village type thing for each noble was called the manor. And this is the center of life in the Middle Ages. It's going to be run by the local lord who lives in this, like a castle, basically. It's a large mansion you can kind of see in this picture. It's not going to be as big as the king's castle, but he kind of has his own private castle here. And on the outskirts of it, or just outside the wall and the moat, you have the serfs' houses. These are the peasants that had a place to live. The church would have been outside it. The knights often would have lived inside this castle area as well, and they all would work together. Now, most villages would have been a little bit bigger than in this picture. This is a scaled down version to show you. But people could gather for celebrations or protection. So if somebody's coming to attack, all the serfs would run into the castle walls area and they would be granted safety in return for the fact that they've been farming and providing food for the nobles. So at the very top of this feudal system is the king. We all understand what a king is. He's the top leader in the land. He's divided up the land amongst barons or nobles. And in return, they're going to promise to be loyal, and they're going to provide him with soldiers. And the king had, as we discussed last time, divine right to rule, which means they believed that God had given them the power to rule, and therefore that was genetic. So royalty is going to be passed down through the firstborn son. If the king has the right from God to rule, then surely his oldest son also has that right. So it wasn't something that was an elected position. And you have the bishop. We discussed this when we talked about the church of the time, but he's the top church leader in the kingdom. Very powerful, because remember, the church had a lot of power at the time and a lot of wealth. So he's kind of like a mini king within that area. Obviously, the Pope is above him, but he's almost as important. And people were tithing or giving offerings to the church, and so the bishop was becoming very wealthy. Barons, that's another word for a noble. They ruled these large areas of land, kind of like their own little cities or their own little villages. They report directly to the king. The nobles typically would have been either friends of the king or possibly family members, but these were men and women, but the men were the ones with the money and the power, because women didn't have that. These were men that had a great deal of wealth. And so sometimes they even had like apartments within the king's castle, and they had a space to just kind of call their own, and they could walk in and out of the castle whenever they wanted. Now they couldn't go into like the king or queen's bedroom without permission. They had certain areas of the castle that were off limits, but they could go hang out and go to parties and just walk around at any time of day in the castle. They were very powerful people, and then they divided up their land amongst other lords and people below them that would maintain an army and help collect up the taxes. So again, these barons are going to maintain the army, and they're going to pay the king the taxes that they have collected. Then you have lords. They're the ones that run the local manor, the smaller section of the village. They were basically knights. They could be called into battle at any time, and they owned everything on their land, including the peasants' crops and village. So they literally owned the peasants' houses. They owned everything that the peasants had. The lady would be the lord's wife. Her job was to take care of the manor. She's going to run the house and have kids. That's her job, literally. That's all she has to do. She doesn't have to worry about cooking and cleaning because she's a lady. She's wealthy. She would have had servants to do that for her. So she just had to make sure that people were, that the businesses were running in order, that people were fed, that the house was nice, that she would maybe throw parties from time to time and celebrations. But she belongs to the man of the house. So women had 0 rights. They were considered property of the men of the house. If she's not married, she is property of her father. When she is married, she's property of her husband. And if her husband passes away, she could be considered property of her eldest son and has to follow all of his commands. At the very bottom were the peasants and servants. Most of the people living in the Middle Ages fell into this category. This was the highest percentage of the population were peasants, and they had a rough life. Some peasants are considered free, so they can own their own business. It might not be super wealthy, but they might own a tavern or be a miller or a blacksmith, that kind of stuff. Some peasants were considered slaves. They owned absolutely nothing, and they had to pledge their loyalty to the local lord and often worked for him directly. These people would work long days, 6 days a week. The only day off they had was the Lord's Day for church because that was super important to everyone of the time period. Even though they worked these long hours, and basically their hours were dictated by sunlight. So from the time the sun came up till the time the sun went down, you were working. They still typically had barely enough food to survive because they're having to give so much of it to the lords and the nobles and the people that aren't working the land at all. So the peasants were kind of left with nothing. So some fun facts about the people of this time. Around 90% of the people were peasants, and they worked hard and they died young. Most peasants were dead before they reached 30 years old. So typical life expectancy in the Middle Ages was not necessarily 30, but peasants typically didn't make it past 30 to 35 years old, just because they worked so hard, but also hygiene and medicine were not as common back then. People sometimes took it, like the joke was you had your monthly bath. So if you're covered in dirt and bacteria and you're not cooking food right and you're not taking care of yourself, you're going to get sick and have weaker immune systems, and things like that are going to kill you faster. We already talked about how kings believed they were given the right to rule from God, called divine right. And the lords and barons would swear oaths to their kings, basically saying, we're going to be loyal to you forever. But the Lord has absolute power over the entire manor. He can even hold court and act as the judge in the court system and decide punishments for crimes. The knights. If you became a knight, you would start training at approximately 7 years old. And they would send you off to the Lord's manor, basically, to work and study under another knight. You're going to learn how to be a knight from watching another knight. He's going to teach you about your armor and fighting and all that. Their job, they promise to be brave in battle. They're going to protect the church. They're going to protect anyone that's weaker than them. And they're going to be courteous to noble women. So each knight has his own coat of arms. That's like his own shield design that identifies him. No two knights had the exact same coat of arms. And they had to follow this elaborate code of conduct called chivalry. And it dictated how they had to behave and the rules they had to follow. So if you wanted to become a knight, typically you were from the noble class. Peasants did not become knights. That was not an option for them. And for most boys, this was a dream job because knights were so well respected. They were wealthy, they had a lot of loyalty, everyone looked up to them. But it was a very expensive job. So there were two ways that a man could become a knight or a young boy. The first was you could earn the right on the battlefield, that you have proven yourself in battle and you've gained that respect, so now you're a knight. Or, as I mentioned a minute ago, you could become an apprentice. You could go live and work for another knight and go through training with him. And training was not a simple year-long process. It usually was about 13 years of training under another knight. So at first, you'd become what's called a page. This was at 7 years old. You go live in the household of a knight, and you're basically a servant to that knight. And the first thing he's going to try and teach you is the proper way to behave and good manners. Because remember, they have this code of chivalry that they have to follow. And it talks about how to treat ladies, how to be polite, how to have good manners, good etiquette. So he's going to start teaching that to a young page. He's also going to start training the basics of fighting, how to ride a horse using no hands and carrying a lance. And basically how to ride a horse quickly into battle with both of your hands occupied by swords or lance or any kind of weapon available. This was basically the same thing as going to school for a young boy that wanted to be a knight. Instead of school, you would be a page. Eventually, at around the age of 17, they could become a squire. And these are boys, teenagers that would take care of the knight's horses. They've been promoted, they've learned the basics, and now they're taking care of all the knights. They're like his personal assistant, taking care of his horses, taking care of his armor, his weapons, making sure the sword has been sharpened, that his armor is polished and clean, and then they would actually accompany the knight to the battlefield. They typically did not go in and fight. They watched from the side, but if needed, they had to be ready to fight at any moment. By this point, they started training with real weapons, and they were taught these fighting skills. They had to be in good shape. They had to be strong. And you would typically work as a squire for 5 to 6 years. Then, by the age of 20 to 21, you would have what's called a dubbing ceremony, and this is where you became a knight. You would kneel down on the ground before another knight, lord, or a king, who would then tap the squire on the shoulder with his sword and pronounce him as a knight. And you would take this oath that you're going to protect your king, you're going to protect the church, you're going to protect those weaker than you, and you're going to live by a code of chivalry. And then you'd stand up, they would present you with your own pair of riding spurs and a sword, and you would officially be considered a knight. So here's this code of chivalry that we've mentioned multiple times. It's the code of conduct. And it includes things like knights had to show mercy, humility, honor, sacrifice, faithfulness, courage, and graciousness. Basically, the knights took an oath swearing to be a good guy, to have good manners, and to be loyal and respectful. If you did not obey the code of conduct, the punishment was typically public humiliation of some sort. So if found guilty of not following the code, they would crack your shield in two. The sword would be cracked over your head, and you could be put into a coffin and dragged to the church where they had a mock funeral. So they basically had the death of you being a knight, because when you came out of the coffin, you were no longer a knight. They took away that right. And this would be a very embarrassing thing that lots of people could come watch. And so it'd be like being stripped of your title. Well, it is being stripped of your title in front of the entire village, as everyone's told that you weren't good enough. They did have a lot of jousts and tournaments at the time. So a tournament was meant to improve skills and show your strength. And you could win money from this. So people would watch in the stands. This was a form of entertainment. Knights would come out and have contests over who had the best poetry or song. And usually the two favorite events were the joust and the melee. So jousting is like in this picture here. You've probably seen it in things before, where two knights charge from opposite sides of the lane, or from the stadium basically, and they try and knock each other off of their horse using this long wooden stick. This could be very dangerous. There were people, in fact, there was a king that died from this. So that is the end of your notes on the feudal system and what it was like living in the Middle Ages.